Let me be clear, I don't like Raheem Sterling, and I never have, and I like the team that he plays for even less. But I simply cannot comprehend why every time England are about to appear in the World Cup, some people seem determined to hobble them before they even get there. Let me take a case in point. And by the way, I like Piers Morgan. Piers Morgan is a friend of mine. But Piers Morgan has launched a bitter attack on Raheem Sterling because of a rather ugly and foolish cartoon that he's drawn on his right shin. Why? Because it's a gun. Piers Morgan, when he's at his slimmest, can often be found wearing an Arsenal football top, whose logo is a gun. The Gunners, Piers. You feel me? The Gunners. The team you support, the Gunners, with a big gun in their logo. And you were foolish enough not to think of that when you launched your attack on Sterling today? What is it about Sterling that he's always in for it? Is it 'cause he's black? Is it 'cause his name is Raheem? Or is it just because he plays for Manchester City? No, it can't be that, because he used to get it when he played for Liverpool. Is it 'cause he's young, gifted, black, rich, and with attitude? And some people don't like that. Discuss 0344 499 1000. Now, I like Roman Abramovich even less than I like Raheem Sterling. And I like Chelsea even less than I like Manchester City. But what did Britain gain from the mean and idiotic decision to so delay the renewal of Abramovich's British visa that he missed the FA Cup final involving his own club, Chelsea? What kind of madness is this? What kind of meanness is this? Do we want Abramovich to pull out of Chelsea, to sell his holdings, to cease his investment in British property, British business, British commerce? Do we want him to spend no time in London? Would we prefer that he takes his billions to Tel Aviv? Maybe he'll pull out of Chelsea and set up an Israeli football team, Macabre Tel Aviv, maybe. What kind of madness is it? Unless, of course, Abramovich is a crook and we think that he's laundering dirty money. And if we do, isn't it time we said so? Isn't it time we arrested him? And of course, none of that is true. He isn't a crook. It's not money laundering. It's investment in the British economy that we have now just willfully kicked in the teeth. And I'll tell you how it happened. I'll tell you why it happened. Because our government, our foreign secretary, our prime minister are in the grip of maniacal hatred of Russia and Russians. We're going to crack down on Russians who've got money whilst welcoming any other person in the world who's got money. What could possibly go wrong? We're ready to take Nigerians, Emiratis. We're ready to take Saudis. We're ready to take Nigerians. We're ready to take Colombians. We're ready to take the filthy rich from every part of the globe but somehow it's Russian rich people that we have a problem with. What's that all about? Don't tell me that this is some Western policy, because I've just been looking at a picture of the President of France cavorting with President Putin at some dacha somewhere. Macron is no Bolshevik. Macron has no communist leanings. Macron just knows that Russia is an important place, and the Russian economy is important to Europe, and that's why he was there. Last weekend, not the one just past, the one before, I saw a picture of Angela Merkel. Not only in Russia, not only meeting Putin, but speaking to Putin in Russian, because she knows that Russia is important. And then in the middle of the week, there was a picture of the Japanese Prime Minister, Abe, also meeting with Putin, whilst we are locking Abramovich out of the FA Cup final when his team are playing in that final. And Abramovich has overnight, which is an issue in itself, being that he's Lithuanian, Russian, immediately flew to Tel Aviv and immediately became a citizen and passport holder of Israel, which has effectively visa-free entry into the United Kingdom, at least for short periods of time. Discuss 0344 499 1000. These are not football issues, by the way, because that's for our sister station, Talk Sport, the best sports station in the entire world, and I've heard them all. But these are political issues. These are race issues, cultural issues about Sterling and about Abramovich. Now, I believe that without taxation, there can be no civilization. No civilization without taxation. That would be my slogan. The Adam Smith Institute is a little less keen on the taxation, though, of course, well-educated fellows as they are, quite keen on civilization. I'd be interested to know how they think we can have civilization without taxation. But they've declared Tax Freedom Day. And it's the latest, apparently, that it's been since 1995. What do I mean by that? Well, I mean that this week is the day you start working for yourself. Until today, you've been working for the government. You've been paying tax, every penny that you've earned, until today. Does seem rather striking, I must say, especially given how much of our civilization has been torn down by the ideological zealots that follow places like the Adam Smith Institute. And yesterday, and for some weeks, I have been proselytizing that the next general election in Britain should be fought between the authentic conservatism of Jacob Rees-Mogg and the authentic Labourism of Jeremy Corbyn. And lo and behold, a whole opinion piece on that very subject has just been written in the Independent newspaper by Dominic Frisbee, almost as if he'd been listening to my show, and Dominic has kindly agreed to come on. He probably wasn't listening to my show. It's probably a case of great minds thinking alike. And talking of great minds, in 1968, Robert F. Kennedy, who would have been, in my opinion, the greatest of all American presidents, was assassinated in a kitchen in California, in a hotel, just after he'd won the California primary to be the Democratic Party's candidate against Richard Nixon in the November presidential election of that year. I never believed the story, did you, that some lowlife, Sirhan, an Arab American of Jordanian Palestinian extraction, I never believed that he had killed Kennedy. And he served 50 years in prison and will never be paroled because he cannot show remorse, because he didn't do it. He remembers nothing of his role in the events, and that's because he was acting under deep hypnosis. It was the CIA that killed Robert Kennedy. At least that's the view of Tim Tate and Brad Johnson, authors of an important new book about the assassination, which has been serialized in a down-market newspaper all of this week. But it's a very good serialization, and it's a very good week. I wouldn't have necessarily brought this up, except Bobby Kennedy Jr., the son, the fourth of 11 children of Bobby Kennedy, has visited Sirhan in prison in Fresno, and has made public his belief that this man did not kill his father, that there were more than one gunman, that Sirhan's bullets never struck his father, that Sirhan's position in the scene meant that he could not have been the man who shot his father in the back of the head, in the back of the neck. And Bobby Kennedy Jr. is demanding the public inquiry, which has been long denied. Well, it's not denied here, because this is the mother of all talk shows. Love Potion number 9. Never tried that one. Edward Lucas is a Times columnist, a Russia expert, and he knows, I presume, in fact I'm certain, what lies behind the deliberate obfuscation of Roman Abramovich's visa application. It ran out. He applied for a new one. They deliberately delayed the granting of that visa, and the owner of Chelsea FC was thus deprived of being at the FA Cup final involving the team that he finances, that he has invested in, that he has built into an international super club. Abramovich is not best pleased about that, and neither are Chelsea Football Club. Edward Lucas, welcome to the show.
Nice to be on the show. Hello, good morning.
Good morning to you. Now, I'm right, am I, that it was deliberate and it was to make the government's overarching anti-Russia point?
Well, I'm not sure it's an anti-Russia point. I think it's an anti-Kremlin point, because Mr. Abramovich made the billions that he did in the 1990s, not, I think, because of his exceptional ability to
run a market stall.
Well, he was a courtier, to put it bluntly. He was a courtier.
No, but he actually did have a market stall. It is a remarkable entrepreneurial success.
Well, I think a lot of people in the 1990s had entrepreneurial talents that were unleashed by the collapse of communism. Not all of them became billionaires as quickly as Mr. Abramovich did, and didn't enjoy his political connections. Mm-hmm. But that's in the past now. I mean, I was a strong critic of that method of enrichment at the time.
You and me both. That it's worth pointing out, Edward, isn't it, that his connections were with the Yeltsin family, and we loved Yeltsin.
Well, I think some people loved Yeltsin. I think people always project onto Russia the image they would like Russia to fit. And so when we want to be friendly towards Russia, we convince ourselves that Russia is just another emerging market, that it's not really an empire, that it's a proper democracy, and so on. And that goes in waves. And then sometimes the scales fall from our eyes and we see that Russia isn't like that. So I think that Yeltsin, we viewed the Yeltsin era through rose-tinted spectacles. And also the other point is we colluded very much in the looting of Russia through the City of London and this wonderful Russian word offshorka, which means an offshore bank account.
I've not heard that one. It's a good one.
Yeah, well, that entered the Russian language not because Russians drove tanks down the city of London, trained the barrels on the Bank of England, and said, "Open your financial system to dirty money, otherwise we open the fire." We did that to ourselves. We decided we wanted a piece of the action, and although our bankers and lawyers and accountants did very well, and people like Mr. Abramovich did very well, the people of Russia did less well, and I think it helped dent Russians' belief in the integrity of the West when they saw that we were colluding with the looting of the country. So it's high time that we asked more questions. It's worth. I know you've had the sharp end of a libel lawyer pointed at you, and it's worth pointing out that Mr. Abramovich was not accused of any crime and denies any wrongdoing. I'm not saying that he falls into any particular category here, but I think that for a very long time we have allowed very rich Russians to come to London and basically buy respectability, whether they endow universities or buy football teams or buy newspapers. And in many cases, that might be exactly the right thing. But we should certainly be asking a few more questions. And it's also worth remembering that there's no human right to a visa. You have the human right once you're in the country to the rule of law and fair treatment by the authorities. But there's no human right to have a visa. There's no human right for a foreigner outside the EU to come into this country, and so I think we've sent a bit of a signal there. And I think that what we're saying to Russians, and indeed we should be saying to Saudi Arabians and Chinese and people from anywhere else in the world, you're very welcome to come here, but we do have some standards, and we are capable of enforcing them. And that's a message that is belated, I think.
Well, unexpectedly, I agree with every single word that you have said, which isn't good for a radio interview. So let me try and
call me an imperialist puppet for a bit, and I'll call you a Putin stooge, and that'll liven things up a bit.
Okay, let me be the devil's advocate. Here we have a situation where we want our cake and eat it. We want Abramovich's 125 million property in Kensington. We want his mammoth investment in Chelsea Football Club, which is an economic multiplier in the west of London. We want a London football team to be a big power in international football. In other words, we want his money, but we want to mess him around to the extent that he goes off and becomes a citizen of another country altogether and may take his bag and baggage there. I would if I were him.
Yeah, but I think that you have to ask who we are. That we as Britons, we need to buy. If you're a banker or a lawyer, an accountant, or someone else on the kind of going business class on the gravy train, then having Russian money coming in is very good. And there's all sorts of people in Britain who make their money catering to the global plutocrats. But I think it's not necessarily good for the country. And I mean, one thing is that it sends house prices rocketing. And many people listening to your program will be thinking, how do I afford a house, or how do my children going to afford somewhere to live? And one of the reasons that house prices have rocketed is the global super rich buying up property in London, which sends ripples all the way through the system. Another thing which is not great is that this isn't free money, that there's a political price comes with this, and we've seen both with the Salisbury poisoning most recently with Litvinenko. People saying, well, yes, we must have some sanctions, show the Russians who are tough, but it mustn't hurt the city of London. And I think that we get the tails wagging the dog there. Our priority should be national security and the integrity of our system. And if you're having people saying, oh, well, what about the city? Or even worse, these people are major donors to the Conservative Party or friends of any other party, for that matter, that's very bad. The country should be run in the interests of the people who live here, not in the interests of our sort of foreign super-rich customers.
Edward, it has been a genuine pleasure, not to cross swords with you, but to agree with you in every particular. Edward Lucas, Times columnist on the Roman Abramovich story. Now, an unexpected outbreak of amity between me and the London Times correspondent Edward Lucas on the issue of Roman Abramovich's visa denial, deliberate delay so that he would miss the FA Cup final. So really, what we're saying is, Mr. Abramovich, we don't want you. We want you to sell your 125 million mansion in Kensington. We want you to divest of Chelsea Football Club, and maybe then Chelsea can go back to the second-raters that they were for so long between the 1960s and the arrival of Mr. Abramovich. We're really saying we don't want Chelsea to be the economic multiplier that it is in West London. We'd rather that Stamford Bridge went back to being a couple of sheds and some terracing. I'm not necessarily against all these things, as you've just heard. I don't like Abramovich. I don't like oligarchs of any kind from any country. But there is no doubt, despite what Edward said, that these standards that he referred to are standards for Russians only, because nobody asked the billionaire developers of the Battersea Power Station to show the colour of their money, certainly to show its provenance. Nobody asked the runaway Nigerian politicians who've bought up much of the Earl's Court area to show the colour and provenance of their money. Nobody asks Arabs, Chinese, Malaysians. Nobody asks any of these oligarchs any questions, never mind difficult ones, and nobody makes any restriction on their coming and going into London. And that's where Edward and I part company. Because if Britain had an ethical foreign policy, an ethical visa policy, I'd be first in the queue to support it. But it becomes the opposite of ethical, doesn't it? If it is being selectively applied only against Russians. Or as Edward put it, Russians with Kremlin connections, though he rather elided my point that Abramovich's Kremlin connections were not with Putin, but were with Yeltsin. Abramovich and many other oligarchs became vastly rich because they had special access to Russia's state-owned assets in the great privatization that Yeltsin heralded and which was supported in every particular by the Times, by The Economist, by the British government, by leader writers. We loved Yeltsin. We loved Yeltsin as he lay drunk on the floor with everyone picking his pockets. That's the Russia we loved. That's the kind of Russian president we'd love to have again. And if we did, I promise you, there would be no problem at all between Britain and Russia. And there would be no problem about Russians, done certain income, getting all the visas they liked. That's my point of view. Give me yours. 0344 499 1000. You can also text me, you can email me, and you can tweet me at George Galloway at Talk Radio. Some people have. Brian Balicki says circumnavigation of visa restriction. Israel has a no visa necessary for UK agreement. Absolute joke, this Tory government. Fra says if there is indeed a public inquiry into Kennedy's killing, will we have a raft of mysterious fires, misplaced documents, and a raft of accidental deaths? The cover-up of all cover-ups will be necessary to protect the guilty in the deep state. And Patrick Vidine says, as a Chelsea fan, I'm none too happy with the way Abramovich has been treated by the pathetic UK government, and I'm disgusted at the way the West has treated Russia since 1989. The UK is fast becoming a rogue state, in common with the USA and Israel. And Darren Alevi says, don't forget all of these great men, George, who could have been President of the United States. Henry Wallace, George McGovern, Ron Paul, Bernie Sanders, John B. Anderson, Ross Perot, Ralph Nader. Many of them had great policies and vision. They would have been a lot better than some of the occupants of that dreaded office. Well, Bobby Kennedy, Donald Trump. Compare and contrast, just saying. Here is Gary in Maidenhead. Go ahead, Gary.
Hello, George. I've followed you for a long, long time and been a very big fan of yours.
Thank you, mate. Thank you.
Paralleled with, if you like, the great Tony Benn, who I met 3 times.
A very, very great man. The greatest Prime Minister we never had.
Absolutely right. What I wanted to say, George, was all this talk about dirty money.
Yes.
I'd like to know what it is.
Yes, a good point. Yeah. When does dirty money become unhandleable?
Well, you tell me, George. I wouldn't know, to be honest. But I know there's a lot of hypocrisy in this.
Yeah.
Okay. It's as far as the mass media is concerned, it's simply it's come to mean Russian dirty money.
Yeah, it's a movable feast, isn't it?
Yeah. Not a word points to the American dirty money and British dirty money. Okay.
Yeah.
And if by dirty money we mean money that's accrued through crime, murder, theft of land, the finest examples are from these countries that now accuse Russia of the very thing they've done in a much bigger and a much grander scale.
Well, we've even got a whole chain of Caribbean tax havens for the money that's too dirty even for the City of London.
Absolutely. Well, it's selling arms to Saudi and making fortunes out of that.
That's dirty money, yeah. That's
Absolutely.
Dirty money.
Okay, genocide. The Americans celebrate a mass murderer every year, Christopher Columbus. Okay, he got rid of the Arawak Indians, and he's celebrated. And they say, well, we know he committed crimes here and there, but he was a great navigator.
Mm.
You know? So the hypocrisy...
Or Captain Cook, you know. I went to Circular Quay in Sydney relatively recently, and there's a big statue to Captain Cook, who arrived in Australia and promptly massacred those that were living there.
Well, there you go. Well, you take people that are... If the crime is big enough, okay, then knighthoods are bestowed, statues are built, and even countries named after them. Okay, Cecil Rhodes, for example, butchered thousands of Africans in Matabeleland to take over their land, and then made it illegal for them to take their land back.
Yeah, and got the country called after him.
And got a country called after him.
Even Kim Jong-il didn't think of that one.
No, that's right. So, you know, to me, clean money is the money earned by labourers and farmers and innovators, the latter frequently having the innovation stolen by the giant corporates. I myself am an inventor. I've invented a few products. Some have gone down like lead balloons, but some have been very successful. And I built up a business some years ago through my lack of experience, but eventually it went belly up. But I learned a lot en route. And there's nothing wrong with business if, in fact, it's conducted. My philosophy has been exploit ideas and don't exploit people. And that's been my philosophy. And
you'll never get on. You'll never get on in the capitalist society that we love so much.
Yes, that's true. Well, not doing too badly at the moment. But as I say, George, I've been a big fan of yours. I thought your treatment of the American Senate hearing was the best I'd ever seen.
That was my best day, yes. That was my best day.
A play about that to rival Hamlet.
Well, that's very, very kind of you to
I thought you were absolutely brilliant.
Thank you, Gary. I sometimes get asked to give motivational lectures to companies and so on about, although it's a bit of a problem because they want to know what preparation I made for such an event. And of course, the truth between you and me is I didn't make any preparation at all. So it's quite difficult to string it out into a philosophy because I was speaking off the cuff. And I was speaking off the cuff because I was telling the truth. And you don't have to have a good memory if you're telling the truth.
That's true. That's true.
Gary, a pleasure talking to you. Thank you very much indeed for calling us. Gary in Maidenhead, 0344 499 1000. That's the number to call. You can email me, text me, or tweet me at George Galloway @Talk Radio. It's George Galloway in for Mike Graham, and it's his music selection that we are, of course, playing. I bear no responsibility for it at all. 0344 499 1000. That's the number to call this show and indeed all shows. You can also tweet at Talk Radio at George Galloway. In this case, you can text the word talk and then your message to 87222 at 25 pence per message on top of your standard network rate. Now, I wouldn't necessarily have chosen HS2 as the best use of a very large amount of public money, but I was sure of one thing. At the time I was a Member of Parliament in the north of England, that if we were going to make some part of the country high-speed rail, then what about the rest? And along comes, like that train you were waiting for, Jim Steer, the director of Green Gauge 21, which is campaigning for high-speed rail for the whole of the UK. So sounds like he's going my way. Jim, thanks very much indeed for joining us.
It's a pleasure, George.
Kindly tell us what your thesis is and I'll test it.
Okay. Well, the thesis is this. Three things. We've got an economy that lags on productivity. We've got a very unbalanced regional economy, and we've got the most congested transport systems in Europe, both road and rail. We think those are interrelated problems. We think that you can get from London to just about anywhere, and if you're setting up a business in London, you've got a huge commuter market to draw on, the largest in Europe, and you've got international gateways. You have all of that. The problem is cities in the rest of the country don't enjoy those benefits, and so we decided to try to write down what would be needed to generate that kind of interconnected network for the rest of the UK. That's what we set out in our report today called Beyond HS2.
Well, I'm with you so far. What would it cost and what's the opportunity cost, which is the issue I might have with you?
Yeah, well, we're not the people to cost this, George, I'm afraid. We're the people that can look at the details of the capacity and connectivity problems, and this is a proposal through to 2040. I know people think, well, we've got to solve things quickly, and we're with them on that. There is an urgency to this. So what we've been able to do is to set out the scale of the schemes needed. But really, you know, the thing with rail investment, and a lot of what we're suggesting is you need to upgrade what we've got, as well as building some new lines. The smart way to do that is when you come to renew things on the existing railway, and then actually getting the improvement in doesn't cost as much as you think. You're going to have to spend money on it anyway. Now, getting into that level of detail, I'm afraid, is the next step. So forgive me, I'm not going to give you a big headline price, but I'm not going to pretend you get this for nothing. You refurbish what we're suggesting, 800 miles of railway, you build 100 miles of new high-speed line, another 100 miles of kind of conventional rail. Yeah, it's going to cost a lot, but hey, what's going to happen to the wider economy? As outside London and the South East, where a couple of big rail schemes are just coming to fruition this year and next. Without this, you know, we are struggling economically.
We are, and the railway we've got is in many respects not fit for purpose. People sitting on floors, paying top prices, very high prices indeed. Certain services in the south of England, Southern Fail and all that, have a very, very bad name. So there will be people who are immediately attracted to massive upgrade in our rail capacity. Some will argue that it needs to be, I would be one of them, that it needs to be in public ownership. But the reason I asked you about opportunity cost is I've been increasingly attracted to the idea of the loop. You're familiar with that as a means of transport. This is the Elon Musk and other models are available of basically a tube, perhaps above the motorway, thus requiring no extra land and so on, which propels people at truly astronomical speeds from A to B. Might that not be better than old-fashioned, steel and timber for a good old railroad?
Well, I'm all for trying out new ideas, but I'm also a believer in looking at how well you can adapt what you've got. The rail technology it's over 200 years old. It's extraordinary that it's been able to be adapted to run, modern light rail systems, high-speed trains, heavy freight, and all the rest of it. And, there is a bit of a lesson in that. If Hyperloop comes about, fantastic sort of, multi-billionaire people sort of promoting it, fine. But, let's not delude ourselves. If you ask people to sit in a new vehicle that's going to travel underground at very high speeds, first off, they're going to be a bit scared and a bit skeptical,
Well, they were pretty scared of the railway, to be fair, Jim. Stephenson's rocket killed a man on its first time out.
Well, exactly. But that kind of plays to my point. You have to evolve this. We've now got believe it or not, we have the safest rail system in Europe. Given all the difficulties we have, that's a hell of an achievement. But as you rightly say, we didn't start off with it. We managed to kill an MP, as you say, watching the rocket, the Rainhill trials, 1829. So these things, getting them safe, getting them so that people are secure and happy using them, is challenging. It does take time. So we can all think of these clever technologies. When I started off my career in transport, it was the hover train. We built a test track down near Peterborough, and that was, that was flavour of the month. Well, it didn't get anywhere. Why not? Well, very difficult to design what in railway terms is a point, a switch, a junction. And a lot of these new technologies actually achieving that. Hyperloop will be the same. It's quite difficult, surprisingly. Steel wheel, that peculiar thing of a flange steel wheel on a pair of rails, is brilliant. You can do that. You can, So I don't want us to diss it, but all I'd urge is don't assume you can convert the technology into something practicable that you and I will really be happy. Say, yeah, let's get on that.
Well, I'd be a volunteer for it right now, but I take, of course, all that you say. Now, HS2 has been controversial enough. How controversial is your idea of HS2 or HS everywhere?
Well, if it was high speed everywhere, I think it would really be a bit of a silly proposition. HS2 is over 300 miles long. In terms of high speed rail, we're talking about a further 100 miles in a project for East Anglia and a project in Scotland, plus some other, if you like, conventional speed railway lines. They too will generate, I'm sure, local concerns, probably objections, even if they're reopening closed railway lines. Quite honestly, most of these closed 50 years ago, and even if that's what you're going to do, and in some places we think that's the right thing to do, people have got used to not having a railway there. People have acquired bits of land. It's always a challenge. All we would say is that going back to the argument about the economy, what rail does incomparably well is get people into the middle of cities. Cities are, like it or not, where the growth's going to be in jobs. So we need to expand our commuter rail networks and make sure we got enough capacity in the linkages between cities. Otherwise, we won't rebalance the economy. The alternative, I'm afraid, is probably to rely on the road network. And you might think, well, there's going to be autonomous vehicles on that, electric vehicles. All kinds of changes, no doubt. But the amount of space you need for that on this rather small island we live on is actually huge. That's what we've been doing for 50, 60 years. Compared with that, the land take for new rail lines, pretty small.
Very persuasive. Jim, how do people see more? Is there a website?
Yeah, www.greengage21.net. The report's uploaded there. I have to say, it's a long read. We think it's very interesting. I hope some of your listeners do. It's called Beyond HS2.
Greengauge is GRENGAUGE 21. And it may be a long read, but I'm a high-speed reader. Thanks very much, Jim Steer, Director of Greengauge 21. I'm George Galloway, in for Mike Graham every day this week between 10 and 1.
The mother of all talk shows with George Galloway.
It's bigly fine.
On Talk Radio.
So very great.
Well, I've said my piece. I think that no civilization without taxation. No taxation, no civilization. And therefore, a fair taxation system is not only necessary, but to be striven for. It's a necessary thing. It's a necessary concomitant to the fact that when you fall down in the street, you are picked up by an ambulance, that the street lights are working on a dark night, that the doctors in the hospital to which you are taken are the best that they can be, that the school your child goes to is the best that it can be, that the playing fields of England continue to grow and flourish, etc. You get where I'm standing on this. Now, the Adam Smith Institute, named in honour of the High Priest of Capitalism from Kirkcaldy, no less, in Scotland, has instituted something called Tax Freedom Day, which commemorates the day on which you stop working for the state and you start working for yourself. And this year, it's apparently the latest it's been since 1995, when John Major was the Prime Minister. Sam Dimitri is the head of research at the Adam Smith Institute, and he's been kind enough to join me now. Sam, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me on.
Now, what's so good about Tax Freedom Day?
Well, I think it's very hard sometimes when we throw different statistics and numbers at each other. But something like Tax Freedom Day makes it really visual and really real, the idea of how big the tax burden actually is, how much income each year that's earned ends up going on just meeting the government's tax demands to fund public services, to fund some things we might disagree with, some things we might support. And I think that informs the public debate, and it gives you an idea of where we should be going in the future. You know, if we can say that, look, the tax burden has been gradually rising for the past sort of 20 years, was there an electoral mandate for that? Well, maybe there was, maybe there wasn't, but I think the point that's interesting is that at the very least the public should have a good idea of what that is. And I think often the public don't have a great idea of what the total tax burden is without sort of tools like Tax Freedom Day.
Now, how are you computing this, Sam? Are we talking about personal income tax and value-added tax? You've included VAT, I presume?
Well, we add in all taxes, so that's everything from insurance premium tax, air passenger duty, corporation tax. We add up all of the taxes, and then what we do is we look at a proportion of what's called net national income. So it's a bit like GDP, but what it takes into account is things like depreciation and foreign earnings. So if we're making money abroad, or the value of our things, the machinery we use is getting worse over the years, we factor that in. So it's a better measure. The problem is, because it is a better measure, but it's not the main measure that the government usually used to measure national wealth. The statistics have recently had to have been revised quite a lot recently, so we can only go back to 1995 now. But if you look at other measures, by the way, what you've seen is that Tax Freedom Day is probably the latest it's been since probably 1985. So that gives you a bit of perspective on it. But I think one of the important points on taxes is we pay taxes even if we're not actually handing over the check to the taxman. So things like corporation tax, we looked at all of the empirical research on corporation tax a few years back, and we averaged up how much of the burden comes out of lower wages for workers, and we found it was just over half the burden actually came through in lower wages, because firms would invest less, and as a result, workers would be less productive. So I think it's very important that we factor every single tax in.
Yeah, it's hard to avoid the conclusion, though, that you think of tax in a pejorative way. Is that the Adam Smith way?
Well, look, I think tax is a cost and spending is a benefit. We've got to make sure that we've added it up in the right way. You know, some spending probably is justifiable. I mean, we're not calling, you know, to abolish the state entirely. But what we are saying is that there are some areas of spending that are perhaps inefficient. There are some taxes that probably harm growth more than the benefit from the spending that they fund. And I think we should be having a real discussion, especially as people are calling for the tax burden to go even higher, perhaps to fund more spending on the NHS. Are there ways of, you know, finding better savings within what we currently raise in tax? You know, perhaps we could look at certain benefits like the triple lock for pensions, where you're seeing the incomes going to pensioners rising a lot faster than they're going to the working population. We might look at things like agricultural subsidies once we leave the EU, which tend to reward wealthy landowners at the expense of the general public. I think. You know, we can have a nuanced discussion about this. But there are some areas where taxes, you know, where the benefits of spending are justifiable, but there are some areas where we could do better with it. We could spend that money better, and as a result, you know, Tax Freedom Day won't creep into June as it's sort of, I think, forecast too. If you look at all of the different spending pledges that are getting added up.
I suppose the suspicion is that you're trying to save rich people tax.
Well, my aim isn't to just increase the incomes of the wealthy, but I do think there are problems with relying so heavily on the very, very rich to pay taxes. You know, we have a system where 1% of earners pay 28% of the total tax take. The problem with that is you've got very, very volatile tax incomes. So when we hit the financial crisis and the Great Recession followed, the tax take fell massively because what happens is the very, very top earners have much more volatile incomes. They're much more responsive to things like the performance of the stock market. I also think that it's also about incentives. Taxes on capital, so things like corporation tax, things like capital gains tax, what they do is they disincentivize saving and investment actually is what drives productivity. So the more we invest, the higher the better machinery workers have to use, and as a result, the higher workers earn. And if you actually look at the countries where investment is higher, they tend to earn more. Britain actually has very, very low levels of investment because the tax system, while low in some areas, actually does place a relatively higher burden on capital than other countries in Europe.
Well, of course, it's been lowered. Corporation tax that you referred to is now at a pretty historic low, I guess, though you may know the numbers better than me. And, of course, there's the issue of tax avoidance. You see, the ordinary Joe listening to this is paying more tax because the ordinary Jolian is avoiding tax, and he's avoiding it perfectly legally, no doubt. But if he were paying his share, the burden on the ordinary Joe would be less.
Well, tax avoidance is kind of a tricky issue because it's quite hard to distinguish between what's honest tax planning, you know, what's doing what the system wants you to do, and actually, you know, trying to skirt around the rules, taking advantage of badly drafted laws. So if you say even an ISA, you could say that you're avoiding tax. I wouldn't look at that in a pejorative way, but perhaps if, you know, you're setting up 5 different shell companies, lending things to each other and sort of moving things around, that might be. And I think the revenue you can raise from the latter stuff is probably not that huge. The revenue you could raise by cracking down on the smaller stuff, you know, making it harder, you know, getting rid of ISAs or things like that, is probably quite large. But I think that would come at a cost. And ultimately, I think the reason why we have a lot of these sort of ways of reducing your total tax burden, like ISAs, like capital allowances, is because we think that they encourage good things and that we don't want to distort people away from saving and investing. On the corporation tax point, it's quite interesting because while the actual total corporation tax rate has fallen, what's also happened is that capital allowances that look at things like whether you can, how much of your taxable income you can deduct from investing in a new factory or new equipment, new machinery, that's actually also got a bit weaker. So the actual level of tax that affects whether you invest or not hasn't changed by quite as much. It's fallen a little bit, but it hasn't fallen by the same rate as the actual headline rate of corporation tax has fallen, which was. And that was mainly designed, I think, to make Britain a more attractive place to do business, to draw in other companies, other countries' capital, and other countries, firms, so that they start in Britain rather than, say, in Paris.
Finally, and I'm grateful for your time, Sam, and you're a most eloquent spokesman for the Adam Smith Institute, I must say. What about these big companies? I shan't name them because other companies are available. That do fantastically big business in Britain, yet claim that they aren't making very much profit. People who sell us a lot of coffee, people who sell us a lot of books and other goods over the internet and so on. Surely that kind of avoidance, let's call it, could be circumvented by transaction taxes, so that one of these companies, for example, paid the Exchequer something every time it made a transaction, whether or not it was making a profit on it.
Right. Well, economists tend to think transaction taxes are very bad ideas because what they do is they encourage you to make fewer transactions. You see it with stamp duty, for instance, where people are discouraged from moving house very frequently because the stamp duty bill is so high.
I haven't noticed that in London, I must say.
Well, people don't move as much as they would. So the Australian government looked at stamp duty, for instance, and they found that for every pound of revenue it raised, 75p was lost in economic welfare because people were spending time in houses that weren't quite right for them but were too afraid of the tax bill to move. Now, on the issue of whether companies are paying their fair share, now I think the important point is that for some companies, it's almost certainly the case that they aren't turning a profit. I think one of the coffee chains you mentioned, the reason why they don't turn a profit is they're pretty much loaded up with debt. Now, the tax system does favour debt finance over equity finance, and I think that's a problem. And I've actually advocated before that we fix this. But they aren't. But the reason they aren't paying tax on corporation tax is because they aren't turning a profit. Now, they do bring in a lot in VAT when people spend money in those shops. There's other issues where firms, through intellectual property, their intellectual property is based in either low tax jurisdictions or it's based in, Silicon Valley. Now, we have what's called a source-based taxation system. So we tax where the profits are generated. So if you invent, the next electric car technology, but you do it in America, you're not taxed on that invention in the UK. But for other taxes like VAT, we do tax where the money's spent, not where the idea or the product is created. Now, I think actually moving to a more VAT-like system where you're taxed on the destination of where the activity takes place, not where it starts out, is actually a sensible idea and does make tax avoidance a lot harder. You might be interested to know that actually Paul Ryan, when he put together the US tax reform, his plan originally was to do that.
Sam Dimitri of the Adam Smith Institute, thanks for joining us today. I know you'll be celebrating the rest of the day and not necessarily working. I hope you have a happy Tax Freedom Day. Oh, thank you for that one. My late father, God rest his soul, used to sing me that song. Now we're talking about Abramovich, we're talking about Raheem Sterling, we're talking about tax, we're talking about high-speed rail, but some people want to talk about other things. Here's Incog Inquisitor. Why doesn't Israel help its Western partners and place sanctions on Russia? Israel plays both sides. They take billions from the US and then help Russia's drone program. And an expletive at the end. That's a new one on me. Certainly, Russia has a long and historic relationship with Israel. It has visa-free travel arrangements both ways. There are millions of Russians who live in Israel, and there are many Israelis who invest in Russia. And whilst they're on different sides of the Syrian conflict, they are careful to limit the extent of their confrontation. Frank says it suits Abramovich to blame the UK government for moving citizenship to Israel. Is it more to do with the fact that he'll not have to pay tax in Israel and the source of his $8.6 billion will not have to be disclosed? Great show. Have moved from a local London radio station. Thanks, Frank. Well, I don't think he has to disclose it in Britain. I don't think he pays much tax in Britain, but he does spend a lot of money in Britain that he might not now do so. And I think he moved his citizenship for the reasons I've stated, that Britain was, as a matter of political harassment of Russians, deliberately delayed the renewal of his visa so that he missed the FA Cup final, in which the team, Chelsea FC, that he has invested many hundreds of millions of pounds in, was playing and indeed won. And that's a very odd way of showing that Britain is open for business in the immediate pre-Brexit period. I mean, we're going to have to make up our mind where we stand here. We're leaving the EU, rejoining the world, but we're falling out with much of the world. We're falling out with Russia, and for Russia, read China, and so on. It's a very, very schizophrenic approach, in my opinion, by the British government. Tell me where you stand. 0344 499 1000. That's the number to call. The legend that is Cyril in Beddington has done so. That's why he's up next. Go ahead, Cyril.
Yeah, hi, George.
Hi.
Yeah, thanks for letting me speak to you today. This Abramovich thing, for me, is just another example, of a really weak government's endless narrative of Russophobia. I mean, the thing itself is very small beer and it's sort of tokenist, but it just suits the narrative, all this Syria, stuff, poisoning, athletic drug scandals, aircraft downing, and it just goes on ad nauseum. But behind this, I've been looking for the reason why, cui bono. And I'm wondering, do we have to create such a monster in Russia and in Putin, to guarantee, the ultimate unaccountable blank check that is Trident and all that goes with it? Or is it Snowden? Is it Assange? Or is it that our government is now so weak that we are left to be exploited by the American neocon military, industrial complex?
Yeah, although except the American president is accused of being a Russian agent. I mean, it seems to me that Britain's stand on Russia is shared by absolutely nobody in the world. It's not shared by the French president, the German chancellor, the Japanese premier. It's not shared by the president of the United States. It seems to be a very British thing. And I just think that's very odd. It's peculiar and self-disfiguring, self-harming, no?
Yeah, without doubt. I mean, we have created, through successive governments. I mean, we used to be upheld as the government of fairness, and the Americans always wanted us on side in any endeavour in order to sort of guarantee some sort of air of respectability. But Blair saw to that, that Gulf War thing saw to that, and all that's come with it. And we're very weak now and totally indecisive. I mean, it reminds me of the dithering weakness of the Chamberlain government, and God bless poor old Nev. I feel very sorry for him and his legacy and the rest of it. But we are at that point now where we don't own anything. we're being exploited, I think, to further other people's ends. And
well, that's a very interesting comparison, Cyril, and I hadn't thought of it before. The comparison of Theresa May and Neville Chamberlain. It's actually quite apt in many respects. Certainly, both will suffer reputational destruction once they have, once they have left office. I've just written a piece for RT.com looking at the Theresa May premiership as if it's already ended, because in a way it really has already ended, no?
Well, it's just so weak. I mean, Cameron, blew the Europe thing. And the rest of it, I don't know. I know you're sort of, you're pro sort of, getting out of Europe and the rest of it. But what it's done, it's created a certain turmoil in this country, and I feel that we are being exploited, George, and we're sort of jumping from one thing to the other. That there is no sort of firm line in it, and it's worrying. I get deeply worried that we're doing stuff at the behest of others. And let's not forget that this government, they're trying to stand for morality, and we might as well have the Orwell 2 minutes of hate with Putin up there. It's getting to a bit of a joke.
Yeah, except nobody really buys it. If they did buy it, I'd feel it. I'd feel it in the street. I'd feel it in the correspondence columns and so on. Cyril, many thanks. Very good to speak to you again. 0344 499 1000. That's the number to call. Well, the music's improving, I've got to say. This is George Galloway in for Mike Graham. As the great Ian Lee says on Twitter this morning, you can judge a radio station by the B team it fields during bank holiday periods. Well, I'm that B team, and I hope you're finding it convivial. 0344 499 1000. That's the number to call. I'm in for Mike Graham every day this week between 10 and 1, which sadly means there'll be no mother of all talk shows on Friday night. I'm deeply sorry to learn that, and I think the listeners will too. I'm ready and available to work twice in one day, but it's probably illegal. 0344 499 1000. That's the number to call. You can tweet me at George Galloway at Talk Radio. You can text me, text the word talk and then your message to 87222, and that'll cost you 25 pence plus your standard network rate. Frank Kelly has emailed. No, I've done that one. Here's another. X-Ray Vision says, wasn't the Eurotunnel new technology for the people of Europe when it came out? If we can cross the water to another continent, we can go anywhere, surely. And Patrick says, it's very sad that RFK was murdered in 1968, just 5 years after his brother, JFK, in 1963. The deep state in the USA has a lot to answer for, but the controllers are starting to make mistakes, and peoples of the world are seeing through the lies. Thanks for that, Patrick. This, believe it or not, is Jack Kennedy's 100th birthday. Shot down, of course, in 1963, his brother following in the same manner in 1968. And I've never believed the official story on either case. And we'll be talking about RFK's assassination with the co-author of a book in the final hour. And Time for Changes says, HS2 is a complete vanity project. And if it's that good, why aren't private investors climbing over themselves to be involved? I can guarantee that I could fly from London to Manchester at a fraction of the assumed future rail fare. I smell snouts in the trough, he says. And Lizzie says, do you have jitters when George Soros visits the UK to support Open Britain's plot to keep us supplicant to the behemoth European Union? The Home Office should refuse this wealthy as Cretius meddler entry to the UK, whose aim is to support the democracy he thinks will suit his agenda. And Bambolio says 93% of money in the UK has been made by private banks as debt with interest applied. Stop this. Put cash creation as pensions and funding infrastructure and public services. The money is in the system and no individual taxation needed. Very simple, he says. Didn't sound that simple to me. And Maya says, don't let the press bully you. They don't know your story. Just desperate for headlines. Leave Raheem alone is her hashtag. I must say, I think he's been badly treated, Raheem Sterling, and not just on this occasion, but on others too. And Not PC says, basically you're talking about wanting a communist state, just like what Jeremy Corbyn wants. Well, I am not now, nor have I ever been, a communist. And Jeremy Corbyn, whom I've known for 40 years, is not now, nor has he ever been a communist. And I don't know quite what has provoked this baseless accusation. Charlie is in Glasgow, and he's on the line. Go ahead, Charlie.
Hiya, George. How are you?
Hi, mate. Yeah, good, thanks.
Hiya. I just wanted to say a couple of things about the anniversary of Bobby Kennedy's assassination.
Yes.
Had Bobby Kennedy been elected, one of the first, it's widely reported, one of the first things he was going to do was he was going to mount a proper investigation of his brother's murder.
Yeah, for sure he would, yeah.
Yeah.
And the second thing he would have done was withdraw from Vietnam 7 years before they actually withdrew.
Well, I can actually beat that as well in a sense, because JFK he made a speech in the June of '63 at the American University, and your listeners, I would suggest, respectfully suggest that your listeners should Google this speech, because this was after the Cuban crisis, and what John Kennedy was talking about was, and this is in an open public speech, and he was saying, why doesn't the America and the USSR, instead of having two competing space races, why not have one space race joining together? And instead of having, a Pax Americana, have a real peace not imposed on other countries by America. I mean, and these things point towards, a simple, surely an obvious conclusion that John Kennedy was going to change things radically. This is after Cuba. And in doing so, he would have been a real threat to the American military establishment. Vietnam would never have happened the way it did, even in John Kennedy's time, and the whole Cold War tensions would never have been the same had John Kennedy been re-elected.
Well, I agree with that entirely.
Yeah.
I'm a great admirer of both of the Kennedys and of the
So am I.
Bobby more even than Jack. And I'm really in no doubt it's kind of not rocket science. You look at who benefited from the murder of both men, whose interests were threatened by the political power of both men. And it leads ineluctably to the conclusion that the nexus between the deep state, the military-industrial complex, and the criminal classes in the United States is so obvious it's staring you in the face, Charlie.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree with everything that you say. I mean, but the thing about it is that I don't think it's actually widely appreciated just what John Kennedy was going to do. I mean, that speech that I was talking about, he made a similar speech at the UN just a month or so afterwards, but which said the same thing, basically. But, the suggestion that America and the USSR should have a joint space race.
Yeah.
I mean,
well, we might have been on Mars by now if they had.
Well, I mean, it would have sort of made a whole sort of nonsense of the Cold War tensions. Yeah, really, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
It just would not have been the same. And as you say, Vietnam would never have been the same at all. And the whole world history would probably not have been the same at all. So.
Well, I mean, obviously I had an ethnic and religious magnetic draw. Jack Kennedy was the first, the only Roman Catholic to be President of the United States. He faced bigotry and discrimination on that ground. They said he'd be taking his orders from the Pope and so on. But I believe that Jack Kennedy was a great president that would have become greater, that Bobby Kennedy would have become a great president, and that Ted Kennedy would have been a great president. And all three of them were scuppered, two by murder and one by his own weaknesses and by the exploitation of those weaknesses. Don't you think?
Yeah, I think so as well. I mean, I think Ted Kennedy has never questioned the whole Chuff Quiddick episode. He's never really said anything about it.
Well, he won't now. He's of course deceased, like them all. But because they all had so many children, there are now many more Kennedys emerging. And Bobby Kennedy Jr., who was, I think, the fourth of his 11 children, has now visited Sirhan in prison. He has said that he does not believe the official narrative and is demanding that the inquiry, the investigation be reopened, which has been refused with an ironclad determination by the state, which itself is quite suspicious.
Yeah, I mean, and also my understanding is that what Sirhan, the Palestinian who is alleged to have shot Bobby Kennedy, he cannot get parole because he does not admit guilt, because he says, well, I was under some kind of a hypnosis at the time.
Yeah, we'll be talking to the co-author of the book quite soon, actually, on that. It will be fascinating listening. As it has been talking to you, Charlie, thanks very much for that call. Charlie in Glasgow, if you want to join him, 0344 499 1000, that's the number to call. What you didn't know before you played that is that I have to play that in the car all day long because my 4-year-old loves it. From, of course, the Sing rendition rather than the original Elton John, but a very wonderful number it is. 0344 499 1000. That's the number to call the mother of all talk shows. Now, I have a rare visitor, rare indeed, both because of his qualities, but also because I normally talk to people on the phone, which is much less satisfactory. He's Dominic Frisbee, who is both a financial writer, a political writer, and a stand-up comedian, and he's one of the ports of call I have on my agenda for the Edinburgh Fringe, for the festival in August. Tell me, Dominic, about that first of all. Tell me, because you write such serious things and so well, many people will be surprised that you've actually been a stand-up comedian much longer.
Well, yeah, I've been a stand-up comedian for many, many years, and I find it very hard to reconcile the comedy with the financial and political philosophy.
I don't know, it's quite fertile ground, really.
If you stick in jokes, it sort of undermines the message a lot of the time. So I tend to sort of keep the two separate, and people struggle to think, well, how can you be a financial writer and a comedian? But, we live in the age of freelancers and multiple income streams and all that kind of thing. So, yeah, I do both. And but looking forward, I'm doing a
Tell me what gig you've got.
Well, I'm doing a game show, financial game show in Edinburgh this year, and it's going to be a bit like, Play Your Cards Right or The Price is Right or something like that, but about finance and economics. So highbrow, lowbrow.
Where is it on, do you know?
Gilded Balloon.
Okay, I'll be there. And my missus is listening. She'll be putting that in the diary right now.
Okay,
but Dominic,
you can win bitcoins, silver, and £500 in cash every show.
A very good friend of mine, Max Kaiser, was one of the earliest pioneers of the Bitcoin thing, and he frequently, in fact, not frequently, he perpetually advised me to get Bitcoins, and I never did.
There's people who, I mean, the whole world is kicking themselves because they missed it.
Yeah.
The whole world. It's been
I hope
the most
Maxie
amazing.
didn't miss it. I hope he wasn't just giving out advice. I hope he was laying some aside.
I think he's done all right.
Now, it's not that I want to talk to you about. Fascinating though all of that is. I have been saying on here for months that Britain deserves the dichotomy of Jacob Rees-Mogg, the authentic voice of conservatism and of Brexit, by the way, versus Jeremy Corbyn, the authentic voice of Labourism. The rest are just pretenders. That's true of the Social Democrats in the Labour Party and the Social Democrats in the Conservative Party. And then I read from your gilded pen exactly the same thing today. So, although we agree on this point, let's explore why we think other people should agree. Just advance your thesis, would you?
Well, my thesis is that ever since Tony Blair came along with his third way politics, the left of the Labour Party, and there's a strong sympathy with socialism in this country and left-wing views. It might not be a majority view, but there is a strong sympathy with it, and it is a very legitimate view. But the left of the Labour Party got completely overlooked in Tony Blair's
Tell me about it.
Electoral pragmatism.
I'll show you my scars.
Well, I was about to say, and anyone who was on the left was either no-platformed or smeared or ridiculed, and they were basically shut out, and the left lost its voice. But worse than that, Tony Blair and Gordon Brown, I was about to say George Osborne, Freudian slip, Tony Blair and Gordon Brown did things that no socialist would sanction. They went to war in Iraq. That was not a British socialist thing. Gordon Brown presided over rampant corporate expansion,
gambling,
rampant, house prices,
deregulation of gambling,
and student debt, all sorts of things that are a total betrayal of the left of the Labour Party. And the Labour Party was born in socialism, and so the left lost its voice. And I think the fact that it was the left of the Labour Party was effectively disenfranchised is one of the reasons there's so much anger on the left today. But then along came the Tories, and they looked at Tony Blair's success, and they copied it, and they did exactly the same thing. And the whole of the Tory, they found David Cameron and George Osborne, and George Osborne's basically a social democrat, as you sort of implied in your introduction, and they did exactly the same thing. And the right of the Conservative Party was shut out. Anyone who was in favour of anyone who was Eurosceptic was xenophobic or racist. Any traditionalists who questioned things like, gay marriage, they were suddenly backward, and activists were swivel-eyed loons, and the right of the Conservative Party had exactly the same thing happen to it that happened to the left of the Tory Party. And so suddenly we have Jeremy Corbyn, who is immensely popular with his supporters, and we have Jacob Rees-Mogg, who stand for traditional socialist values and traditional Tory values. And here is an election, first time since probably the mid-1980s, where you have a Conservative and a socialist standing against each other. And that's honest politics. And all this sort of occupying the middle ground stuff, it's created this culture in politics where nobody answers the question, nobody has a philosophy, nobody dares utter their philosophy. And what does Theresa May stand for? She stands for absolutely nothing. And now, Brexit was the biggest basically the biggest election in British history, if you could call it an election. It had greater voter turnout, and it was, in terms of numbers, it was the greater majority. Now, a leader who was standing for Brexit in the last general election, as Theresa May said she was, should have walked it. And she didn't. She got that hung parliament. And if nothing else, that hung parliament was a rejection of what I call in the article centrist vapidity. And we don't want this centrist stuff for. And if the centrists turn to me and say, well, where's our voice? Well, there's the Liberal Democrats, or do what David Owen and Shirley Williams and
Roy Jenkins.
Roy Jenkins, thank you. His name escaped me for a moment. Did in the 1980s.
Not me, because I put him out of Parliament in 1987.
well done. But politics needs a centre voice, and if the Liberal Democrats are never going to win an election, so form your own party. Be revolutionary. And
this phrase, centrist vapidity, is so good. I wish I'd coined it, and I will say it from now on with due attribution, of course. You're right. Cameron and Osborne and Blair and Brown were two cheeks of the same backside, weren't they?
Yeah. I mean, Osborne was doing things like, Help to Buy was basically, the Tory party stands for low tax and minimum state. The tax code doubled under George Osborne. It stands for lowering the national debt. The national debt, according to some measures, doubled under Osborne. It rose by £500 billion. You know, Osborne's economic policies, intervention in the housing market, it was his stamp duties at the upper end. Again, you may or may not agree with them, but they are not Tory values. And Osborne betrayed the traditional values of the Tory party as much as Brown betrayed the traditional values of the Labour Party.
Now, here's an additional curiosity to your thesis. When it came to Brexit, I followed the line of my now deceased leader, Mr. Benn, Mr. Foote, Mr. Shore, Mrs. Castle, and others like them, and campaigned to withdraw from the European Union. Because for me, the European Union is itself this centrist vapidity of which you speak. Do you agree with that?
Utterly.
This isn't good for radio.
I mean, it isn't good for radio, but I mean, utterly and entirely. It's a centrist, bureaucratic movement. And the irony is that the Labour Party in the north of England especially has vast amounts of sympathy with Brexit. There were loads of traditional left-wingers who voted to leave the European Union. And the Tories' biggest growth market now, if you like, to use a horrible term, but its biggest growth area is disenfranchised working-class Eurosceptics in the north of England. That's where it's voted, you know, people who went to UKIP. That's where that's the people it should be appealing to. And Jacob Rees-Mogg does appeal to those people.
Now, you see the way we're talking here. In the country, it has a resonance, has an echo. In this building, even this building, the Talk Sport building, never mind the media as a whole, you write for The Independent. And
I write for whoever will hire me.
Right.
I'm a freelancer, you
okay. know. But in The Independent today, you have this tremendous piece. Inside that building, if they've still got a building, I know they're a website now, in the media bubble, in the political class bubble, what we're seeing now is some kind of heresy. There is hegemony inside the bubble for this centrist vapidity. And people like you and me, though we have many political differences, I already can detect, are regarded as, beyond the pale. How do we break out of that bubble? Or how do the people get into the bubble to break it open?
I don't know, but we're seen as extremists. I actually think I'm pretty moderate. I mean, I'm very libertarian in my politics. But there's two ways. Now, the way the media works is the stronger your opinions and the more boldly you state them, the bigger platform you get. Whether you're Owen Jones on the left or Nigel Farage on the right, the bolder you make your statements. But you almost become a caricature if you do that. And like my editor at Money Week, who I write for, something he always said to me is, when you rant, you confirm the biases of those who already agree with you, but you alienate the undecided. So I've always tried in everything I've written to take a very measured approach and try and appeal to the undecided, rather than take a sort of extreme. I've always tried to write in a very measured fashion. And the result is, and also I've tried to do the same with my comedy, I've sort of tried to be moderate and persuasive. And the result is I don't have as big a platform as I'd like, because that's the way the media works. If you want a big platform, you've got to utter bold, strong stuff.
Well, you'll get a platform with me anytime you want it. Just finally, before the news, I listened on a local London radio station this morning to Jacob Rees-Mogg. And the guy is pure gold. He's honest, he's polite, he's decorous, but he disdains to hide his views, and he will not run away, seek hiding places for that which he believes in, but which, inside the bubble at least, are seen as absurd positions. Do you think he's got a chance? Because I interviewed the deputy political editor of The Sun yesterday, who poured cold water on my view that Rees-Mogg might well be the next Tory leader. Has he got a chance?
Well, I think were it to go before the electorate, he would probably win the election, but I think he would actually stroll the election. But the problem is, within the Conservative Party, he's a backbencher, and to become the leader, you need to have had front bench experience. And
I've only got two words to say to that: Jeremy Corbyn.
Well, it depends if the Conservative Party can get over that bias. Could I ask you a question?
Yes.
This is about why one becomes a politician. Yes. Jacob Rees-Mogg has repeatedly said he wants to be a backbencher, he's comfortable being a backbencher, he doesn't want to be Prime Minister. Surely every MP goes into politics with the ultimate dream of being the Prime Minister. Does any MP go into politics only wanting to be a backbencher?
Dominic, when you buy the former central office of the Conservative Party in Smith Square, a stone's throw from Parliament, trust me, you don't intend to remain a backbencher. He is playing a blinder. If we are to believe his protestations, he wishes nothing more than to sit on the backbenches listening to inferior politicians give inferior advice and decisions. And I don't believe that for 1 minute.
Well, surely everything he has said will come back and bite him if he becomes leader.
No, I think a man who's dragged to the chair, unwillingly, but willing to serve if his fellows wish him to.
It's like Richard III.
It's a tremendous start. Dominic, I'll be at your show at the Edinburgh Festival.
I'm doing a preview at the Backyard Comedy Club next Sunday, and if anyone comes along, it's Sunday the 10th of June, if anyone comes along and says talk radio, they can come in for free.
How about that? There's an offer that you can't refuse. I certainly shan't. Dominic, thanks for joining us. Well, if you've been listening, you'll already know that I am a lifelong lover of the Kennedy family for lots of historic, ethnic, religious reasons, but also political reasons. And I happen to believe that Bobby Kennedy was the greatest president the United States never had. And they never had him because he was gunned down in what have turned out to be mysterious circumstances at the point of his victory in the California primary in 1968. This is, today, the 100th birthday of his elder brother, Jack Kennedy, who was also gunned down in Dallas, Texas, 5 years previously in 1963, bringing to a premature end what also could have been a great presidency. Now, I have always distrusted the official story of both, but I, of course, have nothing like the specialist knowledge of Tim Tate, who's co-author of a new book which is being serialized in England called The Assassination of Robert F. Kennedy. And it's my good luck that Tim Tate is available to join me now. Tim, thanks very much indeed for coming on the show.
Thank you for having me.
Would you kindly adumbrate the principal reasons for distrusting, doubting, disbelieving even, the official story of the killing of Bobby Kennedy?
Well, the official story is that he was shot in the kitchen pantry of the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles in the very early hours of June the 5th, 1968, and that his assassin was a young Palestinian immigrant to the U.S. called Seyhan Seyhan. And indeed, Seyhan was arrested in the pantry, apprehended in the pantry with not just a smoking gun, but firing a smoking gun. So there looked on the surface to be good reason to believe that he was the assassin. The problem is that the evidence which Los Angeles Police Department collected, all of the evidence, and there's an enormous amount of it, all showed that the physics of that simply don't work. Seyhan was always in front of Bobby Kennedy and never closer than 3 feet, whereas the autopsy showed that Bobby Kennedy was shot from a distance of no more than 3 inches behind the right ear. That's simply impossible to reconcile. And every witness in the pantry, there were a lot of them, all agreed Seyhan was always in front of Kennedy and never got in a position to get behind and shoot him. On top of that, he had a revolver, a cheap revolver, which had 8 slugs in it. He fired all 8 of them. He was not able to fire any more. 5 other people were injured. And yet, Los Angeles Police Department and the FBI collected and photographed bullet hole, probably up to 14 bullet holes in the pantry. Now, you can't make 8 shots go into 14 holes. That's simply impossible.
The residue, explosive residue on his collar and his hair on the back of his head leave no doubt at all that he was shot in the back of the head.
Absolutely not. The autopsy was conducted by a coroner called Thomas Noguchi, who was probably one of America's most famous coroners and a very good coroner. I interviewed Tom back in 1991 and 92, and we've kept in touch ever since. I should say I've been working on this story for 25 years, so wow. It's a long old haul for me. And Tom's autopsy, which was an extraordinarily careful and patient and thorough autopsy back in 1968, was absolutely crystal clear, as indeed Tom is absolutely crystal clear. He's still alive today. So he said Bobby Kennedy was killed with a bullet which was fired, all the bullets which hit Bobby, in fact, were fired from a distance of between 1 and 3 inches from behind at a very steep upward angle. The gunman had to have been behind and absolutely jammed up against Kennedy to fire those bullets.
Now, you see, as you describe it, Tim, and this is, as you say, the fruit of a quarter of a century of labours, I'm left with the overarching feeling that how could they get away with such mendacity, with such subterfuge? I mean, it is such an obvious thing.
There's a simple answer to part of that, which is that between 1968 and 1988, so for the first 20 years after the assassination, Los Angeles Police Department and the District Attorney's Authority simply locked away, they suppressed every last piece of evidence. They promised to release it, and they didn't. And it took 20 years and a lot of work by some very doughty campaigners in the US to get those files released to the state archives in California, which is where I got hold of them, as indeed other researchers did.
And yet California is Kennedy country. It's a liberal and democratic state. You would have thought that the political class would have wanted to get to the bottom of this.
California was then, particularly, and I think to some extent still is, a politically schizophrenic state. Bear in mind, it had just, although as you say, it's famous as a liberal-leaning, left-leaning, if you want, state. At the same time, it had just elected, as Bobby was killed, it had just elected Ronald Reagan as its governor. Now, by no stretch of the imagination could you say that Ronald Reagan was a liberal.
And Nixon, of course, was also from California.
It was and remains politically a schizophrenic state.
Now, amongst the many that I haven't yet seen the book, I've read the serialization. It's a treasure trove. But for those who are not as familiar with the case as me, and still less as you, tell us about the girl in the polka dot dress.
The longest running and most heavily argued over mystery in the whole business. On the night, within minutes, literally within minutes of the shooting, a number of witnesses reported encountering a couple, a man and a woman, young man and a woman. And the woman was wearing a polka dot dress, and they all described this very clearly. And some of these witnesses say that they were in a state of glee, and they ran out of the hotel shouting, "We shot him, we shot him." And when challenged, they said they shot Kennedy. The girl, one of the Los Angeles Police Department, ostensibly but quite publicly set about trying to identify this girl in the polka dot dress. In fact, the files, all of the files, and to write this book and to do this work, I had to go through 100,000 individual pages of paperwork, show that what LAPD and the DA's office did was set out to discredit anyone who had seen this young woman. There were 25 witnesses to her. Each of them was targeted, each of them was bullied, threatened, and in the archives, anyone can go there and listen to these or find these if you want them. There are tape recordings of some of the key witnesses being browbeaten. That's the only word. On my website, I've put up clips of this. And the police officer conducting the interview was shouting at the witness during a polygraph examination. I mean, it is. Those tapes are quite extraordinary, and I would honestly recommend anyone who's interested in this to listen to them, because it's very hard to find a benign explanation for them.
Now, the girl in the polka dot dress was part of a couple. He was in a gold top. He was a Mexican-American. If we're to take them at their own word, it was they who shot Kennedy, which means, as we now know, and you've confirmed, that Sirhan also fired all of his bullets, 8 of them, that they were working as a team. What role have you concluded, therefore, that Sirhan played in that team?
I'm going to be cautious about this, because I've been a journalist for 40 years, and one of the things I was taught when I began, and I've tried to apply all through my career, I suppose, is that not to make presumptions, not to make assumptions, only to go with the evidence. The evidence, if you do the work that I and my colleague have done on this, is quite clear. Sirhan was there, Sirhan met and was to some extent involved with this girl in the polka dot dress. Sirhan fired his weapon, but Sirhan has no memory of doing so. Sirhan has no memory of anything between the moment he met the girl in the polka dot dress at a coffee urn in the hotel and when a number of bodyguards, amateur bodyguards for Bobby Kennedy, were jumping on his head trying to wrestle the gun from him inside the pantry. He has no memory of anything else and has not had from day one.
Tim, can you bear with me?
Sure.
Because I need to take a break for some capitalist messages. Now, if you're just joining us, I'm in the middle of a fascinating interview with Tim Tate, co-author of The Assassination of Robert F. Kennedy, an epic work of great importance that I have ordered, and I strongly advise you to also, and this won't be the last time or the last place that I discuss this. Tim, thanks for holding on. Before the break, we were talking about what can only be described as a state of deep hypnosis on the part of Sirhan. That's your thesis, isn't it?
Well, it's not my thesis. I would stress that what we have done is always use documentary evidence. All the psychiatrists and psychologists accepted at the time of Sirhan's trial that he appeared to have been in a hypnotic trance. And that was never questioned. We should explain that Sirhan's trial was a very perfunctory affair because his defense were desperate to keep him out of the gas chamber, since capital punishment was an issue then, and tried to plead him guilty by way, essentially, of insanity. They didn't challenge the evidence. However, the psychiatrists and psychological reports at the time suggested he was in a deep hypnotic trance. Since then, we've worked with a number of other experts, psychiatric and top psychologists, who have dealt with the case, and they have all filed exactly the same formal reports in court proceedings and elsewhere that Sirhan was under hypnosis at the time, which is one reason why he can't remember any of the assassination itself.
And because he can't remember, he can't show remorse and therefore can't be paroled even after 50 years.
That's the ostensible reason. I think it's actually rather more punitive than that. I think it's that there is a view that he was responsible, even though he wasn't, for denying America the chance of a Bobby Kennedy presidency, and that nothing will ever make up for that. And nothing that Sirhan does or could do now will ever change that, in my view.
Now, this hypnosis issue becomes even more startling when you tell us, as I hope you will, of what happened when you finally tracked down the girl in the polka dot dress.
We need just to be cautious, or not to explain. I need to explain here that hypnosis sounds way out. It sounds like something from science fiction. What I'm going to say next does sound something like specifically something from science fiction. But it is a fact, and I know this to be a fact, and I can show this to be a fact because I have the CIA's own documents, that they created throughout the 1950s and early 1960s a program to create a hypno-programmed political assassin. These are not my words. These are the CIA's own words from their own documents released under Freedom of Information legislation. The polka dot dress girl, it seems very clear, was part of a wider conspiracy, and what we say is, on all the evidence, and we've only just touched on a little bit of it, the most likely candidates for the masterminds of this conspiracy are either the CIA, organized crime, or a combination of the two of them.
The nexus of the deep state, the criminal class, and I would throw in the military-industrial complex, were the people with most to lose from both Kennedys in power. And in Bobby Kennedy's case, the confrontation with organized crime and with Hoffa and the corrupt Teamsters Union are very clear in matters of historical record. Neither men would be described, I think, as likely to be of great benefit or not as great a benefit as others to the military-industrial complex. And the deep state didn't much like their take on the world. In that nexus surely is found the actual culprits in this assassination.
Again, we're old-fashioned, old-school journalists, my co-author Brad Johnson and I. What we do is present the evidence and say, these are facts. These are solid evidence. Here's the documents. The book cites not just where you can find the documents, but the page number for each piece of information in the documents. We've been determined that people will be able to find this, check what we say for themselves. On organized crime, Bobby Kennedy's antagonism and his war with organized crime is well known. What hasn't been dealt with until now was what I found in Los Angeles Police Department's own documents. It was advised in 1968 of three separate conspiracies. It was given three separate detailed reports of conspiracies involving Hoffa and organized crime to kill Kennedy. And the informants, they had their names, they gave statements to the FBI, and they were detailed and specific and should have been followed up. LAPD simply buried them. It did nothing with that information.
Now, finally, Tim, and I'm grateful for your time, how important is it that Bobby Kennedy Jr., having now visited Sirhan, has called for the investigation to be reopened and publicly stated that he does not believe the official story of what happened to his father?
I think it's vitally important. We've got a very lengthy interview with Bobby Kennedy Jr. in the book. I mean, it's seeded throughout the book, and he's worked very closely with my co-author, Brad Johnson. And I think it's hard to overstate the weight of the Kennedy name. And there has been a sense for 50 years, well, if this was such a big deal, why weren't the rest of the family weighing in? Why wasn't Ethel or any of Bobby's children saying something? For the first time now, really, the Kennedy family are coming out and saying, this isn't right. This is unsafe, and there is something which needs to be addressed. And ultimately, what we want as authors is the same as what Bobby Kennedy Jr. wants, which is a new, honest, open and transparent official inquiry into what was, in my view, probably one of the most important political assassinations, ever.
Yes. Well, I'm with you on that. What's your website address, and who are the publishers, Tim?
The publishers are Thistle, and it's on Amazon now.
I've ordered it, yeah.
A short video on Amazon, on my author page on Amazon, so people can get a sense of what the evidence looks like and feels like. And the film I made way back in 1992 is on my website, and that's timtate.co.uk. And there are more details of the book and of the film there.
You're a gentleman and a scholar. Tim Tate,
Thank you very much.
co-author of The Assassination of Robert F. Kennedy. What an extraordinary story. One of the most important stories ever. Well, that's uncanny, I say to my friends behind the glass, because that song was played at my father's funeral, because it was one of those that he loved the most. He thought that family was a kind of magic. 0344 499 1000. I have no knowledge of the music that's coming up. This is Mike Graham's team that are supplying what is quite a poignant series of tracks. I don't know about you, but I found that last interview amongst the most important and interesting that I've ever done. And I hope you agree that for a B team, we've done quite well. And if you do, of course, please come back tomorrow at the same time and bring someone else with you. I'm here for Mike Graham every day this week between 10 a.m. and 1. 0344 499 1000 is the number to call me, as Chris in Basingstoke has. That's why he's on the air now. Go ahead, Chris.
Morning, George. Hi.
Morning, yeah.
Yeah, I'm picking up on you talking to the guy from the Adam Smith Institute.
Ah, yes.
And I don't know whether, it may have even been you said it, the full quote of Adam Smith, they always talk about the invisible hand, don't they? And that, the full quote talks about the landowners, the elites, the capitalists. Maybe some invisible hand will stop them from doing the very thing that we see as, as de rigueur for capitalists in outsourcing and all that sort of thing. Anyway, the tax day thing, I don't know, just over the last 30 or since the New Deal in the States and the inception of the welfare state here and that, it's been chipped away at the tax burden. Is that because you picked up on him using it as a sort of pejorative term? The burden is shifted from the top to the bottom, and I don't know the exact.
Trump's last budget was explicitly so, and British finance ministers do the same. They explicitly deepen the burden for the mass and lighten the burden for the apex.
Yep, and that seems to be, and when John McDonnell even mentions Marx, he's like, and it's ludicrous because Marx, he's a German philosopher, he's not a Russian, he's not, you know what I mean? And he mentioned Yanis Varoufakis at one point, and there's like open derision of, he's taking advice from Yanis Varoufakis. Well, he'd do pretty good taking advice from Yanis Varoufakis, I think. A man on the inside of when the IMF told him, he was, they said this is a ridiculous deal. I know Greece will never be able to pay this back, but we've got to do it because, that's the way it is. And Angela Merkel could never be seen to be bailing you out again or whatever. I don't know. I'm blathering on, but
no, I mean, isn't the point to go back to the Adam Smith philosophical point that capitalism, and they are the high priests of it, assumes that the most ruthless, predatory individuals and their system will somehow conspire via some invisible hand to produce a greater good. It's like asking the most amoral, rapacious, greedy people in the world to, by accident, do something good for the majority. It's actually nonsensical if you think about it.
Yeah, and I mean that guy, didn't catch his name, but obviously he's in his bubble of the Adam Smith and Institute and everything, and he's like, it's interesting, stuff, but it's largely, sort of in a world.
It's rooted in a premise that you and I think, agree is a false premise.
The trickle down.
Yes.
I mean, he mentioned Paul Ryan in passing, and Paul Ryan's probably like an Ayn Rand follower. They talk about the Laffer curve, don't they? Whereby if you tax the rich less,
laughable, curve.
Well,
yes.
Laffer, absolutely, you're having a Laffer bloke, mate. Yeah, that guy, and he on the eve of the 2008 crash said, "Oh, everything's fine. The markets are good and everything." Yeah. the idea that people will, if you tax them less, they'll invest, they'll take people on. No, they don't. Maybe on the margins a little bit, but nothing. And just a couple of people, like, and as you always say, you don't need to be ignorant about this stuff. And just a couple of people like Richard D. Wolff, Professor Richard D. Wolff, look him up on YouTube, Steve Keen, the Australian, and Anne Pettifor. I'd say look on YouTube, listen to what they've got to say, and it all makes much more sense than the sort of stuff that our people have been following and sticking to, like austerity. Nonsense.
Let me put it to you this way, Chris. The distinguished light essayist, former deputy leader of the Labour Party, no Bolshevik, Roy Hattersley, gave an example once, writing in The Guardian when The Guardian was worth reading. He talked of a journey he made from Birmingham to London, crawling about 10 miles an hour the entire way, only to discover, close to London, that the reason for the delay had been a man towing a broad-based boat down 2 lanes of the motorway. And that had caused a tailback of 100 miles and the loss to individuals and the economy of many hours, and therefore much money and wealth. And he made this point. The man who owned the boat made what was for him individually an entirely rational and self-serving decision to tow his boat rather than transport it by some other means. But for the rest of us, his individual, rational, self-serving decision was a disastrous one. And isn't that, in a nutshell, the case against capitalism? That individuals will do what is best for them, for their companies, and good luck to them. But to imagine that that is therefore for the greater good, could by any invisible hand become the greater good, is actually absurd.
It's crazy, and well, it's like that. Like I say about Ayn Rand, that whole thing about let the elitist have his dream and build his huge skyscraper and all that stuff, and who cares who gets killed or whatever, because that's for the greater good. And this, I don't know. And also, just to tie it up, I thought that comment that you got about, do you want to be a communist like Jeremy Corbyn? He was probably referring to the discussion about the tax thing, I thought.
I see.
I don't know.
Well, I'm glad you enlightened me on that, Chris, because I was puzzling.
That's the only thing I could think of.
I was puzzling myself about that. Chris, it's been a pleasure talking to you. Thanks very much for ringing. You've still got 10 minutes, I think. 0344 499 1000. Hire this jukebox man. He's fantastic. He wrecks. Now, just to spoil the lunch I'm about to have, my producer Cornelius has handed me this final item. It's a bit like Columbo. Just one more thing. It's a piece from the Times this morning which says that cockroach milk could be creeping on to the menu. I'll read it. Most people would be happy never to meet a cockroach, let alone drink its secretions. But claims for a new superfood could put juice from cockroaches on cafe menus everywhere. Cockroach milk, or postnatal fluid, is the latest fad for foodies looking for dairy alternatives in tea and coffee. Now, you may or may not be surprised that Gwyneth Paltrow is a big guru of this culinary development. In her food and lifestyle website, Goop, well named, has added cockroaches' milk to their animal milk guide. Personally, I can think of nothing more revolting than cockroaches' postnatal fluid in either my tea or my coffee, or my cereal, or anything else. But as I eat no cereal and put no milk in either tea or coffee, I guess I'm safe. But how are the rest of you going to take to it? We're joined by nutritionist Shona Wilkinson. Shona, welcome to the show.
Hi, how are you?
Good, thanks. Are you turned off or on by this development?
Yeah, the story's actually been out for quite a while.
Really?
I think we may have to start getting used to insects in our diet. We're starting to see
Wait till there's a fly in my soup. That was so awful. It was a joke when I was a kid.
There's actually a lot of nutritional benefits to insects, and the practice of eating insects is actually called entomology, and we're seeing it being introduced more and more into our food. Very early stages, admittedly, but it's basically because it's environmentally friendly, it's sustainable, and they're very nutritious insects. The thing about this one is that it is actually a very special type of cockroach, which is called the Pacific beetle cockroach, which is apparently found in Australia.
Can't wait to try it. Well, I mean, they probably trialled it in the I'm a Celebrity, Get Me Out of Here. Is it? Are these the cockroaches that they're forced to eat there?
I don't think they are actually, no. What's unique about this type of cockroach is that they give birth to live young. Most other type of cockroaches give birth to eggs. And while they're giving birth to this live young, they do produce this, as you mentioned, postnatal fluid, which is like little protein crystals. They're like crystals that they feed to their young. And they are just jam-packed full of nutrients, which is why they're looking for ways to incorporate this as an alternative to cow's milk. Many people are looking for dairy alternatives at the moment. And this
Why? Tell us why.
Because more and more people are having intolerances to it, and they're looking for something that's a bit more environmentally friendly as well, and more nutritious, which is why this cockroach milk is being sort of talked about as a superfood. It's apparently 4 times as nutritious as cow's milk.
Wow.
But the problem is how you get the milk. And apparently 10 cockroaches produce 0.5 millimeter of this milk. You can't actually milk them because they're given birth to the crystals. So we're back to the scientists. The scientists have now, they sequenced the genes that are responsible for producing this milk protein to see if they can replicate it. So you just need so many of these cockroaches to produce a tiny amount of milk. How are they going to make it viable? We don't know. But the fact is, it is highly nutritious.
Well, I mean, there are plenty of animals who eat insects, so it must be nutritious. That I'll grant you. But it does raise an interesting point. However discomforted I feel about this idea. I once, the late Tony Banks, a former parliamentary colleague of mine, once put down a motion in Parliament condemning the Korean president who was visiting for the widespread practice in Korea of eating dogs. And I tabled an amendment to say, yes, they should stick to eating cows, pigs, fish, and rabbits, and all the other things that we eat. One man's meat is another man's poison. That's true, isn't it?
Absolutely it is. And we are looking more and more at insects as being a source of food for us. It's commonly eaten in some countries already, as you mentioned. What we're struggling with is eating it looking like a cockroach. So what's happening is that we're seeing it coming into food. So we can now already in the UK, you can buy like protein bars that are made up with insect flour.
Wow.
And it's a ground-up insect, which seems, for the Western world, a bit more of an easier way to eat something like a cockroach or an insect of some sort in a powdered-up manner that you don't notice it's an actual cockroach. But I honestly believe we'll see more and more of this coming into the market, into our foods. Insects, it's the future of food.
Well, I mean, I've heard of chlorinated chicken, but insect flour is a new one on me. What kind of health bars so I can avoid them?
You won't even notice that they're in there. They just taste exactly the same as any other bar that you'll find. It's just that the flour is made from insects. And I promise you, you would not notice the difference. They don't taste of anything. But it's a very environmentally sustainable way of introducing protein into a product.
Well, it's a hot day here, so I'm going to go out into the street with my mouth hanging open. in the hope that some very environmentally friendly protein flies into my open gob.
You
Shona,
watch this space. In 10 years' time, you'll be eating insects and not thinking anything of it.
I hope I'm still here in 10 years' time. Shona Wilkinson, you're a star nutritionist on cockroach milk and how it's the new best thing. And it's endorsed by Gwyneth Paltrow's food and lifestyle website, Goop, G-O-O-P. And I can't wait to log on myself to read Gwyneth's new ideas. I don't know where you stand on cockroach milk and insect flour. I'll pass myself. Let me read a couple because I don't have time for more, and I apologise to all those who've written in and not been called, as it were. The Communicipalist says, Corbyn versus Rees-Mogg is an embodiment of the political polarisation of austerity Britain, I think. The next election will be a decisive engagement in a class war the government has pursued against our most vulnerable citizens on behalf of the rich. Patrick says, the level of tax for middle and above earners has been far too low since Thatcher, and that is the real reason why there is a large national debt and public services have been decimated. The basic income tax rate was 35% during the 1970s compared to 20% now. And X-Ray Vision says the Adam Smith Institute appears to subscribe to the mentality that the top 1% pays 28% of the tax purse, while ignoring the mathematical fact that if you control most of the wealth, it stands to reason that you will pay most of the tax due and avoid most of the tax due also. Well, sadly, for me, the show has come to an end.